The snow-covered plains of Eylau, in what is now Poland, were eerily quiet on the morning of February 8, 1807. Yet, beneath the thick white blanket that covered the landscape, the fate of empires was about to be decided. The French forces under Napoleon Bonaparte stood against the combined might of the Russian and Prussian armies, led by General Levin August von Bennigsen. But unlike so many of Napoleon's previous battles, which ended in swift, decisive victories, this day would descend into a nightmare of bloodshed and confusion. Eylau was not going to be a typical Napoleonic triumph. It was going to be a brutal test of endurance, with thousands paying the ultimate price in a battle that would leave both sides questioning their strength. The Battle of Eylau would be a stark reminder that not all battles were won by genius alone, and not all wars were about glory. Napoleon had hoped for another rapid victory, as he had achieved at Austerlitz and Jena. His Grande Armée had swept across Europe, defeating nearly every army that dared to challenge them. However, the campaign in Poland during the winter of 1806–1807 proved to be more grueling than anticipated. The French army, bogged down by poor weather, muddy roads, and dwindling supplies, had not been able to deliver a knockout blow to their enemies. The Russian army, commanded by General Bennigsen, had managed to evade Napoleon's pursuit throughout the winter months, engaging in a series of skirmishes without being forced into a decisive engagement. But as February began, Napoleon's patience wore thin. Determined to bring the Russians to battle, he marched his troops toward Eylau, where Bennigsen had decided to make his stand. The Russian army had been reinforced by a contingent of Prussian soldiers, and their combined force totaled nearly 67,000 men. Napoleon, commanding around 45,000 troops, was significantly outnumbered. However, as always, he believed his superior tactics and leadership would carry the day. As dawn broke on February 8, 1807, the two armies faced each other across the snow-covered plains. The temperature had plummeted, and a heavy snowfall during the night had blanketed the battlefield in a thick layer of white. Visibility was poor, and the cold was brutal, yet both armies prepared for what would become one of the bloodiest and most indecisive battles of the Napoleonic Wars. The battle began with an artillery exchange. Both sides unleashed devastating volleys of cannon fire, but the snow and poor visibility made it difficult to accurately target the enemy. The French artillery, usually so effective in breaking enemy lines, struggled to find its mark in the blinding conditions. The Russian artillery, however, was positioned on higher ground, giving them a slight advantage as their cannons rained death down on the French positions. Undeterred, Napoleon ordered an attack on the Russian right flank, hoping to turn Bennigsen's position and force a retreat. The French infantry advanced, marching through the deep snow with difficulty, their brightly coloured uniforms stark against the white landscape. As they approached the Russian lines, they were met with a hail of musket fire. The Russians, entrenched and well-prepared, poured volley after volley into the advancing French, causing heavy casualties. Despite the withering fire, the French soldiers pressed forward, engaging the Russians in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the Russian lines held firm. The deep snow made it difficult for the French to maneuver, and their attacks soon began to falter. Sensing an opportunity, Bennigsen ordered a counterattack. Russian infantry, supported by Prussian cavalry, surged forward, pushing the French back across the snow-covered field. For a moment, it seemed as though the French lines might collapse entirely. Napoleon, realizing the danger, quickly ordered his reserves into action. Marshal Jean de Dieu Soult's corps, along with Marshal Michel Ney's reinforcements, were sent forward to stabilize the situation. At the same time, Napoleon directed his cavalry to make a daring charge against the Russian centre, hoping to break through and shatter Bennigsen's army. The French cavalry, led by Marshal Joachim Murat, charged across the snow-covered plain, their horses' hooves kicking up great clouds of powder as they thundered toward the Russian lines. It was one of the most dramatic cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars. Thousands of French cavalrymen, swords drawn, smashed into the Russian infantry. The sheer force of the charge broke through the Russian lines, sending shockwaves through Bennigsen's army. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Napoleon's bold gamble might pay off. The Russian centre began to waver, and French cavalry swarmed through the breach. However, the victory was short-lived. The snow, which had hampered the French advance all day, now worked against them. Murat's cavalry, unable to maintain momentum in the deep drifts, was soon bogged down and vulnerable to counterattacks. Russian artillery, which had been repositioned during the French advance, opened fire on the exposed cavalry, cutting them down in droves. The battle descended into chaos. Both armies were exhausted, and the snowstorm that had plagued the battlefield from the start only intensified. Visibility dropped to almost nothing as the snow fell in heavy sheets, obscuring friend and foe alike. Units became separated in the blinding storm, and the fighting degenerated into a series of disjointed skirmishes across the battlefield. As night fell, neither side had gained a clear advantage. The Russians, though battered, had not been broken. The French, though they had made some gains, had been unable to capitalize on their initial successes. Napoleon, realizing that he could not deliver a decisive blow under these conditions, reluctantly called off the attack. The battle ended in a bloody stalemate, with neither side able to claim victory. The toll on both armies was staggering. The French suffered nearly 25,000 casualties, while the Russians and Prussians lost around 15,000 men. The snow-covered plains of Eylau were littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. It was one of the bloodiest days of the Napoleonic Wars, and yet it had accomplished little. Both armies limped away from the battlefield, bloodied and bruised, but not defeated. For Napoleon, the Battle of Eylau was a bitter pill to swallow. Used to delivering swift, decisive victories, he had been unable to break the Russian army. His plans for a quick campaign in Poland had been thwarted by the brutal winter and the stubborn resistance of Bennigsen's forces. Although he would eventually claim victory in the campaign later that year at the Battle of Friedland, Eylau remained a stark reminder that even the greatest generals could be brought low by the harsh realities of war. For the Russians, Eylau was a moral victory. Although they had suffered heavy casualties and been forced to retreat, they had stood their ground against Napoleon's vaunted Grande Armée. The battle had shown that Napoleon was not invincible, and that, under the right conditions, his enemies could hold their own against him. It was a boost to Russian morale, and though Bennigsen would later be criticized for failing to deliver a decisive blow, the fact that the Russian army had not been destroyed was seen as an achievement in itself. The Prussians, too, took heart from the battle. Having been decisively defeated at Jena-Auerstedt the previous year, the Prussian contingent that fought at Eylau saw the battle as an opportunity to redeem themselves. Though their role in the battle had been relatively minor compared to the Russians, their presence on the field was a symbol of their continued resistance to Napoleon's dominance in Europe. In the broader context of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Eylau was a turning point. Not because it changed the course of the war, but because it marked the first time Napoleon had been unable to secure a decisive victory. It was a battle that showed the limits of even the greatest military minds and the brutal cost of war. The snow-covered fields of Eylau, soaked with the blood of tens of thousands, stood as a stark reminder that not all battles were won by brilliance and strategy alone. Sometimes they were simply about survival. The Battle of Eylau would go down in history as one of Napoleon's few inconclusive engagements, a brutal reminder that war, even for the greatest of commanders, could be unpredictable and unforgiving. It was a battle that had no true victor, only survivors. In the aftermath, both armies withdrew to lick their wounds and prepare for the next round of fighting. Napoleon would go on to achieve a more decisive victory at Friedland a few months later, but the memory of Eylau would linger. For the men who fought and bled on that frozen battlefield, it was a day of horror and heroism, a day when war showed its darkest face. The snow would eventually melt, and the bodies would be buried, but the memory of the Battle of Eylau, of the cold, the blood, and the terrible slaughter, would never be forgotten by those who survived.